Tonight feels like a good night to slow things down, the kind where nothing needs to be solved or remembered. As the world grows quieter, we step gently into the calm routines of Celtic Druids, not as mysterious figures, but as patient observers of land, seasons, and everyday life. Their knowledge moved slowly, passed by voice, gesture, and long familiarity rather than written words. If you're new here, you're welcome to subscribe, like our video, and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now settle into stillness, let your thoughts soften, and let's begin. Before the Roman legions marched north, before Christian monks set quill to parchment, the lands we now call Ireland, Britain and Gaul belonged to peoples who measured time by the growth of oak trees and the movements of stars. Among these Celtic communities lived men and women who spent decades learning to remember, to heal and to guide. The Druids, whose lives were far quieter and more deliberate than legend suggests. Tonight, you'll discover what their days actually look like, stripped of magic and myth, revealing something perhaps more remarkable: ordinary human wisdom, patiently accumulated over lifetimes of careful attention. You're standing in a hillside settlement in what will one day be called Wales, though that name won't exist for another 1,000 years. The year, if such a thing could be measured in the way you understand it now, is somewhere around 300 years before the Common Era begins. The morning air carries the smell of damp earth and wood smoke, and you can hear the bleating of goats from the enclosures below. Your name doesn't matter much here. Identity comes from your family, your skill, and your place in the community's web of relationships. You're 16 summers old, which means you've recently passed from childhood into something else. Not quite adulthood, but a space where choices begin to solidify into a life's direction. Your hands are already calloused from farm work, your back familiar with the weight of water buckets and bundles of harvested grain. But you've been chosen for something different. The druid who visits your settlement twice each year, an older woman named Dubnovelaunos, which translates roughly to strong in the ways of the world, has been watching you since you were small. She noticed how you remembered the stories told around winter fires, how you could repeat them months later with every detail intact. She saw that you asked questions not just once, but returned to them, turning them over in your mind like stones in a river. Yesterday, she spoke with your family. The conversation was long and serious. Becoming a druid means leaving behind the ordinary trajectory of life in your community. You won't marry young, won't inherit your father's fields, and won't spend your years perfecting the craft of weaving or metalwork or animal husbandry that occupies most people's days. Instead, you'll spend the next 20 years learning things that can't be touched or sold. Vast quantities of poetry, lore, genealogy, healing practices, and the movements of celestial bodies. Your mother held your face in her hands before you left, looking at you with an expression you couldn't quite name. Pride, certainly. Sadness, too. You won't disappear from her life, but you'll belong more to the community as a whole than to your immediate family. Druids serve everyone, which means they can't be too embedded in any single household's interests or feuds. Now you're walking through morning mist, following Dubnovelaunos up a path that winds through oak and ash trees. She hasn't spoken since you left the settlement's boundaries. This isn't awkwardness. You're learning already that druids are comfortable with silence in a way that makes most people uneasy. She walks steadily, her staff clicking against stones, her cloak heavy with moisture from the low-hanging clouds that turn the landscape into something soft and undefined. The place you're heading isn't a temple. The Greeks and Romans, who will later write about Druids, will struggle to understand this concept and will invent elaborate forest sanctuaries because their own religious experiences occur in constructed spaces featuring columns and altars. But Druidic learning takes place in ordinary locations, made significant by use and attention. You're going to a grove where several Druids gather to teach students, but it's simply a place where old oaks grow in a rough circle, offering shelter from wind and rain. When you arrive, 3 other young people are already there, sitting on fallen logs that have been worn smooth by years of use. 2 girls and a boy, all within a few years of your age, all wearing the same expression of nervous excitement that you imagine shows on your face. One of the girls you recognize from a settlement 2 valleys over, seen at seasonal gatherings. The others are strangers. Dubnovelaunos seats herself on a flat stone and gestures for you to join the others. 2 more Druids emerge from the trees. An elderly man whose beard reaches the middle of his chest, and a younger woman who might be 30 or 35 summers old. No introductions are made. You will gradually learn their names through context and usage, just as you learn everything else here. You've been told your learning will take 20 years, the old man says. His voice is surprisingly gentle, almost musical. Most of you believe that, but don't really understand it. 20 years from now, you'll be different people. You won't remember clearly who you are today. This is as it should be. We're not teaching you facts to memorize and then use unchanged. We're teaching you to become a different kind of person, someone whose presence steadies a community, whose memory serves as a living archive, and whose judgment is trusted because it's been trained through decades of careful practice. He lets the scent settle into the morning air. A crow calls from somewhere in the canopy above you. You notice how the light filters through leaves, creating patterns on the ground that shift with every small movement of branches in the breeze. Today, you learn nothing, he continues. Today you sit here and watch the day pass. You notice what you notice. Tomorrow we begin. And that's what happens. For the entire day, nothing. The Druids sit quietly, occasionally shifting position. At midday, the elderly man vanishes and reappears with a basket of bread and apples, which they share in silence. The other students fidget, exchange glances, and struggle with the absence of activity. You try to sit still, but your legs fall asleep, your back begins to ache, and your mind cycles through the same thoughts repeatedly until they become tiresome even to you. As the sun drops toward the horizon and the light turns golden, Dubnovelaunos finally speaks. This is harder than you expected. You thought learning would be active, would feel like acquiring something. But first, you must learn to be still. You must learn that wisdom isn't collected like berries in a basket. It grows slowly, like these oaks, in a soil of patient attention. Tomorrow, you return. We begin with the oldest stories, not because they're first, but because they take the longest to settle into your bones. You walk back to your settlement as evening deepens, your mind oddly quiet. Something about the day has already changed your relationship with time. Hours passed without achievement, yet they didn't feel wasted. You spent a day learning to wait, and somehow, impossibly, it feels like this might be the most important thing you've learned in years. Your family wants to hear about your first day, but you find it difficult to explain. We sat, you tell them. We watched the grove. They nod, puzzled but respectful. Already, A small distance has opened between you and the life you knew before this morning. This distance is comfortable. It's simply there, like the first step on a very long path. The next morning arrives grey and damp, with rain so light it barely qualifies as precipitation, just moisture in the air that slowly soaks through clothing. You return to the grove to find the elderly druid. You've heard others call him Katumandos, already seated, apparently unbothered by the wet. You sit on a log that is taking on the shape of your body as the other students arrive. We begin with the cattle raid of Flidais, Katumandos announces. Not because it's the most important tale, but because it contains the seeds of 47 other stories you'll need to know. You'll learn it line by line, phrase by phrase, until you can recite it without thought, the way your tongue knows how to form your name. He begins. His voice shifts into a rhythmic pattern, somewhere between singing and ordinary speech. It's a specialized mode of delivery that carries the words forward with a momentum that makes them easier to remember. The story starts with a description of a ruler's hall, the number of posts supporting the roof, the types of wood used in its construction, and the patterns carved into the doorway beams. This level of detail continues throughout. Numbers of cattle, names of warriors, descriptions of landscape features, and the proper protocols for challenging a rival. You try to hold it all in your mind, but after 20 lines, you're lost. The details blur together. How many cattle? Was it the oak door or the yew door that featured the spiral pattern? Panic rises in your chest. If you can't remember the opening of a single story, how will you possibly master 20 years of material? Katumandos stops. Good, he says, though you've done nothing. You've just discovered that your mind as it currently exists is inadequate for this task. This is the necessary starting point. You must now learn to make your mind different, not smarter, but structured differently. We don't have writing to store our knowledge. Our knowledge lives in human memory, passed from breath to breath, generation to generation. This job requires techniques. He begins again, but this time he asks you to visualize the hall he's describing. Close your eyes, he instructs. Build it in your mind. Count the posts as I name them. See the grain of the wood. Place yourself inside this hall. You're standing near the eastern wall, by the third post. Feel the densely packed earth beneath your feet. The story continues, and you follow his instructions, constructing a mental space and populating it with details. When he finishes the section, he asks you to recite it back. You stumble, forget the name of the ruler's wife, and transpose 2 numbers, but you remember more than you thought possible. The technique has given the information something to cling to: spatial locations, visual imagery, and emotional resonance. Again, he says, and repeats the passage. You repeat it back, getting closer, this time, again. This continues for hours. The same 20 lines over and over until your voice grows hoarse and your mind feels stretched like leather that's been soaked and dried. But slowly, astonishingly, the words begin to stick. They start to feel inevitable, as if they could only be said in this particular order, with these details. The structure of the verse itself becomes a mnemonic device, each phrase leading naturally to the next through rhythm and sound patterns. Around midday, Dubnovelaunos brings food: bread, cheese, dried fish. You eat mechanically, your mind still running through the morning's lines. You notice the other students doing the same, their lips moving silently, their eyes unfocused. The memory techniques we're teaching you aren't supernatural, the younger woman druid says. Her name, you've learned, is Andekamateros. she who stays to the end. They're simply formalized versions of what your mind already does naturally. You know the way home because you've walked it often. It has visual markers, and it connects to your memories. We're teaching you to construct similar paths in your imagination, to create spaces where knowledge can live. The Greeks will later call this the method of loci, the method of places. They'll think they invented it, but people across the world have understood this principle for as long as humans have needed to remember complex information without writing it down. That afternoon, Katumandos introduces the next section of the story, another 20 lines that continue from where the morning's recitation ended. But before adding new material, you and the other students must recite the morning's lines together, in unison. This exercise serves multiple purposes. You're beginning to understand. It reinforces the memory through repetition. It establishes the communal nature of this knowledge. You're learning to speak with one voice, to become living vessels for shared cultural memory. And it creates a rhythm that makes learning itself less tedious, almost meditative. The days that follow blur into a pattern. Each morning you review everything you've learned previously, adding the weight of repetition to knowledge still settling into long-term memory. Then you add new lines and sections, building the story piece by piece, like constructing a stone wall. The process is slower than you imagined possible. A month passes before you've learned the complete cattle raid of Flides, a story that takes perhaps 45 minutes to recite fully. But something remarkable has happened in that month. The story no longer feels like foreign material you're forcing into your head. It's become part of your internal landscape. You can walk through it at will, examining details, understanding how each element connects to others. And Katumandos was right. Embedded within this one tale are references to dozens of other stories, genealogies of families, descriptions of territories, and examples of legal principles. The cattle raid is a node in a vast network of cultural knowledge, and by learning it thoroughly, you've begun to perceive the shape of that larger network. Next month, we begin the courtship of Etan, Dubnovalaunos announces. It connects to 41 points in the cattle raid. As you learn it, you'll start to see how our stories form a web, each one supporting and illuminating others. By the end of your training, you'll carry in your memory a library that would fill a large room if it were written on papyrus like the Greeks do. But it won't be dead knowledge preserved on animal skin. It will be living knowledge, renewed with each recitation, adapted subtly to each community's needs, preserved through the only permanent storage medium humans have ever had, the chain of teaching from one generation to the next. You walk home that evening with your mind full of cattle and magical transformations and the precise legal protocols for resolving disputes over grazing rights. The story plays in your head without effort, and you realize you've begun to think in its patterns. When you see your family's cows returning from pasture, you automatically count them in the formal enumeration style of the cattle raid. When your younger brother asks you a question, you almost respond in the rhythmic verse of Druidic recitation. Your mother notices. "You're changing," she says. It's not a criticism, just an observation. You nod. You can feel it yourself, your mind developing new structures, new capacities. You're learning to think in ways that your previous education, practical and hands-on, never required. The stories aren't just entertainment or moral instruction. They're technologies for organizing and preserving complex information across generations without losing fidelity to the original formulations. 20 years, suddenly seems less like an incomprehensibly long time and more like barely enough to master what you're beginning to understand is a sophisticated intellectual tradition refined over centuries, equal in complexity to anything the literate civilizations of the Mediterranean world have produced. Different, certainly, not written, but no less rigorous. Although it is not permanently recorded in physical form, it is arguably more resilient as long as communities continue to value and support the individuals who carry this knowledge. It will endure anything up to the complete destruction of the culture itself. You fall asleep that night reciting the opening lines of the cattle raid, your voice whispering into the darkness of your family's roundhouse, adding your breath to the chain of breath that stretches back through your teachers to their teachers, and beyond them to names and faces lost to time, but whose words still live, passed forward mouth to ear, generation after generation, refusing to be forgotten. 3 years have passed since that first morning in the oak grove. You're 19 now, though age matters less here than it did in your former life. What matters is how much you've memorized, how deeply you understand the connections between stories, and how well you can apply the principles embedded in the tales to actual disputes and questions brought by community members. You've learned 17 major stories, each connected to dozens of shorter ones. You've learned the genealogies of 63 families, stretching back through generations until the ancestors blend into mythological figures whose reality is less important than the relationships they establish. You've begun learning the plant lore, which herbs soothe fevers, which can be used to clean wounds, which strengthen a laboring woman's contractions, and which ease the pain of dying. But today is different. Today, Andika Materos has asked you to walk with her to a settlement 3 valleys away, where a dispute has arisen that requires druidic judgment. This will be your first time witnessing how the knowledge you're acquiring actually functions in the practical world beyond memorization and recitation. The walk takes most of the morning. Andika Materos sets a steady pace, not fast but unrelenting, the kind of walking that eats distance without exhaustion. She quizzes you on the plant's uses, seasonal variations, and stories as you pass them. A hawthorn tree prompts a discussion of boundary markers and the legal principles governing shared grazing lands. A stream crossing becomes an opportunity to review the genealogy of the family who claims fishing rights here. A druid must know the landscape as intimately as the stories, she explains. Every feature has history, ownership, and significance. When you judge a dispute, you're not applying abstract law. You're working with specific places, specific families, and specific relationships that stretch back generations. The law is embedded in the land itself. The settlement you're approaching is smaller than your home community. Perhaps 20 roundhouses clustered around a central area where animals are penned and grain is stored. People stop their work as you enter, offering respectful nods. A druid's arrival is always significant, but not frightening. You represent stability, continuity, and impartial judgment. Your presence means problems can be resolved without violence, without fracturing the social bonds that hold communities together. An older man emerges from one of the larger houses, followed by a woman of similar age. Both look tired, worn down by whatever conflict has brought them to request druidic intervention. Behind them, watching from doorways and work areas, other community members observe with the careful neutrality of people who know they might be called as witnesses. Andika Materos greets them formally, invoking the proper protocols. She introduces you as a student here to observe and learn. This is appreciated. Your presence means the proceedings will be handled with extra care and turned into a teaching opportunity, which adds weight and significance to the resolution. The complaint is brought forward. The man, named Maglokunos, claims that the woman, Riano, has allowed her pigs to repeatedly break through the boundary fence and damage his grain storage. He's repaired the fence multiple times, but the pigs continue to find ways through. He wants compensation for the destroyed grain and assurance that the problem won't continue. Riano doesn't deny the pigs have caused damage, but argues that Maglokunos placed his grain storage too close to the boundary in the first place, creating temptation. Furthermore, she claims he's been deliberately feeding her pigs during festivals, making them familiar with his property, so he can't now complain when they wander there. Andekamateros listens to both without interrupting. She asks clarifying questions about the location of the storage, the construction of the fence, the timing of the breaches, and the species of oak trees that mark the boundary. She asks to see the disputed area, and everyone walks to the location, a gentle hillside where fields meet. She examines the fence, the terrain, and the distance between the storage and the boundary markers. Then she does something unexpected. She sits down on the grass and closes her eyes. For a long time, she's simply still while everyone waits. You understand, from your training, that she's reviewing the relevant stories and legal precedents in her mind, searching the vast library of memorized knowledge for guidance on how similar disputes have been resolved in the past. Finally, she opens her eyes and begins to speak. But she doesn't announce a judgment immediately. Instead, she recites a story, one you learned in your second year, about a dispute between two brothers over shared cattle. The story is nearly 1,000 lines long, and she delivers it without hesitation, her voice falling into the rhythmic pattern that marks formal recitation. The story isn't random. It contains, embedded within its narrative, the principles that will guide her judgment. As she recites, you see the community members settling in to listen. Some sit, others lean against fence posts. Children edge closer. This is how law is transmitted here, not as dry codes, but as living stories that illustrate principles through example and consequence. The tale she's chosen shows how boundary disputes arise from gradual encroachment, how both parties typically bear some responsibility, and how resolution requires acknowledgement of mutual error and agreement on future conduct. When she finishes, Andekamateros applies the story's principles to the current situation. Maglokunos did place his storage structure too close to the boundary, not enough to be clearly wrong, but enough to create ambiguity. Riano has allowed her fence maintenance to lapse, and pigs being what they are, they've exploited every weakness. Both have contributed to the problem. The resolution she proposes honors both parties while solving the practical issue. Maglokunos will move his grain storage back 3 paces from the boundary line, placing it unambiguously on his land with clear access paths. Riano will rebuild the fence section using stone rather than wood, making it genuinely pig-proof. The destroyed grain will not be compensated, as Maglokunos contributed to the loss through his storage placement, but Riano will provide labor assistance for the storage structure's relocation as an acknowledgement of her pig's damage. Both parties nod slowly. It's not exactly what either wanted, but it's fair, and fairness is what matters. More importantly, the resolution restores balance. Neither party loses face. Both take responsibility for their part in the conflict, and the relationship between families is preserved rather than poisoned by festering resentment. Before leaving, Andekamateros recites another, shorter piece, a section of genealogy that reminds both families of their common ancestry 6 generations back. This is subtle but important. It contextualizes their current dispute within a longer history of connection and cooperation, making continued conflict seem not just unwise, but contrary to their deeper identity as related community members. On the walk back, Andekamateros is quiet for a long time, letting you process what you've witnessed. Finally, she speaks. You saw how slowly the operation proceeded. We could have simply commanded them, do this, do that. It would have been faster, but it wouldn't have taught anything, wouldn't have healed anything. By making the judgment emerge from shared cultural knowledge, by connecting it to stories everyone knows, and by taking time to consider carefully, we create resolution that lasts. The law isn't something we impose, it's something we discover together, written in the stories we all carry. You think about the 3 years you've already spent and the 17 still ahead. The pace of your education suddenly makes more sense. You're not just learning content, you're learning to inhabit time differently, to resist the pressure to rush toward conclusions, and to let understanding develop at its own necessary speed. In a culture without writing, where nothing can be quickly referenced or looked up, this patience is essential. It's essential. Most people live urgently, Andekamateros continues. They rush from task to task, season to season, always pressing forward. We live deliberately, not better, just different. Our function is to remember, to consider, and to see patterns across generations that individuals caught up in immediate concerns can't perceive. This approach requires a different relationship with time. You're learning to measure your life not in days or years, but in cycles of learning and transmission. You're learning to think in generations. That night, back in your settlement, you sit by the fire after everyone else has gone to sleep. The flames create shifting patterns of light and shadow on the walls of the roundhouse. You think about Maglakunos and Riano, their dispute now resolved. The tension that would have poisoned their interactions now diffused through careful attention and the application of generations of accumulated wisdom. You think about how the stories you're memorizing aren't historical records or entertainment, but living tools for maintaining social cohesion, for resolving conflicts, and for passing forward hard-won knowledge about how humans can live together without destroying each other or the communities they depend on. 20 years no longer seems long at all. It seems barely enough time to internalize what's required, to shift from someone who knows stories to someone who embodies the tradition itself, who can access that vast memorized library instantly and apply it wisely to the infinite variations of human conflict and confusion that arise in community life. You're learning patience, not as a virtue in itself, but as a necessary foundation for everything else. And you're learning that hurry is the enemy of wisdom, that the quick answer is almost never the right answer, that taking time to consider, to recite, to remember is not procrastination, but method. The only way to honor the complexity of both human relationships and the knowledge tradition you're being trained to carry forward. It's your 5th year of training now, and the focus has gradually shifted from pure memorization toward practical application. The stories continue. You're working through increasingly complex genealogical material that tracks relationships between communities across territories larger than you knew existed in childhood, but more of your time is spent learning to read the natural world with the precision and depth that characterizes Druidic knowledge. This morning, you're walking through an early autumn forest with Catumandos, whose age makes long walks more difficult, but whose knowledge of plants remains unmatched. He moves slowly, stopping frequently to examine specimens, to explain relationships between species, and to demonstrate harvesting techniques that preserve plant communities for future use. The Romans, who will someday write about us, will claim we worship trees, he says, running his hand along the bark of an old oak. They'll get this exactly wrong, as they get most things wrong. We don't worship trees. We observe them. We learn from them. We understand how their presence indicates water sources, soil quality, and the history of human use in an area. An oak this size is perhaps 300 years old. Think about what that means. This tree was already here when your great-great-great-grandparents were children. It will be here when your great-great-great-grandchildren are old. Trees teach patience in ways humans can't. He shows you how to identify oak species by their leaves, their acorns, and their growth patterns. There are subtle differences that matter. Some oaks prefer wetter soil, others drier. Some grow in community, others stand solitary. The presence of particular oak species tells you about the land's history, whether it's been cleared for agriculture and later abandoned, or whether it's primary forest that's never known human interference. When you're asked to settle a boundary dispute, Catumandos continues, understanding trees is essential. His boundaries are marked by significant specimens, the old oak, the lightning-struck ash, the twin hawthorns that grow intertwined. You must be able to identify these markers decades after they're established, must understand how trees change over time, and must recognize when someone is lying about a boundary by claiming a tree as a marker when its age proves it wasn't there when the boundary was set. The education is astonishingly detailed. You learn which mushrooms fruit in which seasons, which of them can be safely eaten, which cause visions, which kill slowly, and which kill quickly. You learn the life cycles of beetles and butterflies, not from curiosity alone, but because their presence or absence indicates changes in the environment that affect human communities. A failure of a particular beetle species means problems coming for the grain harvest. An abundance of certain butterflies suggests the winter will be mild. Catumandos teaches you to forecast weather by observing cloud patterns, wind directions, and animal behavior. This isn't magic, though it might look like magic to someone who doesn't understand the patient observation behind it. It's pattern recognition, refined over generations of careful attention. The particular way birch leaves turn in the wind before a storm. The smell of the air when frost is coming. The behavior of cattle who sense atmospheric pressure changes before humans consciously notice them. Weather knowledge is power, he explains. When to plant, when to harvest, when to move animals to higher pastures, when to prepare for hard conditions. All of this depends on reading the signs. Communities that ignore these patterns suffer. Communities that attend to them thrive. Our role is to maintain this knowledge, to remind people of what the patterns mean, and to advise when conditions suggest deviation from ordinary practices. You learn the plants used for healing, yarrow for bleeding, willow bark for pain and fever, chamomile for digestive upset, and valerian for sleeplessness. But the learning goes far beyond simple lists of uses. You learn when in the plant's growth cycle, different parts are most potent. You learn which soils produce stronger medicine. You learn how to prepare remedies, tinctures, poultices, and infusions. And critically, you learn when not to intervene, when a body's own healing processes are better left unassisted. The worst healer is the one who must always do something, Katumandos says. Most illnesses resolve themselves given time and rest. Our remedies help with symptoms, pain, fever, nausea, but they don't cure. The body cures itself if given the chance. Knowing when to offer remedies and when to simply sit with someone, keeping them comfortable while their body does its work, is more important than knowing every plant in the forest. One afternoon, a woman from a nearby settlement arrives at the grove looking for Dubnovalaunos. Her daughter, she explains breathlessly, has been in labor for a day and a night, and the child hasn't come. The midwives are worried. Dubnovalaunos listens calmly, asks several questions about the woman's symptoms, then gathers several plants from her stores, raspberry leaf, motherwort, and blue cohosh, and prepares an infusion. This will strengthen her contractions, she explains to you as she works, but it must be given carefully, in the right amounts, at the right intervals. Too much will exhaust her. Too little won't help. This is why plant knowledge requires years of training. These same herbs, given to a woman who isn't in labor, could cause miscarriage. Context matters as much as the remedy itself. You accompany her to the settlement, carrying her bag of supplies. The laboring woman is tired, but not in danger. The labor is simply long, the child reluctant. Dubnovalaunos examines her gently, speaks encouragingly, and administers the infusion in careful doses over the next several hours. She sends you to gather fresh water, to prepare food for the woman to eat between contractions, and to maintain the fire at a specific temperature that keeps the birth room warm but not stifling. The child is born near sunset, healthy and squalling. The mother, exhausted, drinks another preparation, this one to slow bleeding and encourage milk production. Dubnovalaunos stays through the night, monitoring both mother and child, offering quiet advice to the anxious family. You watch how she combines plant knowledge with simple presence, how she calms worried relatives with steady confidence, and how she knows when to act and when to simply wait. Walking back to the grove the next morning, both of you tired but satisfied, Dubnovalaunos talks about the intersection of plant law and human care. The plants matter, yes, but equally important is the calm authority you bring. Fear makes everything worse. It tenses muscles, clouds judgment, and exhausts people faster. When you enter a crisis with plant knowledge and steady presence, you change the situation just by being there. People believe help has arrived, and belief itself is healing. Your education in natural knowledge continues through years of accumulated experience. You learn to identify hundreds of plant species, to understand their relationships with insects and animals, and to recognize how they indicate broader ecological patterns. You learn animal behavior, which birds signal the approach of storms, which mammals indicate the health of forest ecosystems, and how to read tracks and scat to understand what animals are present in an area and whether their populations are stable. You learn about soil, about water, about the slow processes of erosion and renewal that shape landscapes over centuries. You learn to see time at different scales, the daily cycle of a flowering plant, the seasonal movements of deer herds, the decades-long succession of plant communities after forest clearance, and the centuries required for rivers to alter their courses. This knowledge isn't separate from the stories and genealogies. It's all woven together. The tale that explains why a particular spring is considered sacred is also a mnemonic device containing information about the spring's water quality and the medicines that grow near it. The genealogy that tracks a family's lineage also tracks their traditional land holdings and the natural resources those lands contain. We are the keepers of the relationship, Katamandos tells you one evening as you sit by the fire in the grove. Relationships between people, yes, but also relationships between people and land, between present communities and past generations, and between human needs and natural cycles. This is why our training takes so long. You're not learning separate subjects. You're learning to see connections, to understand systems, to hold complex, interconnected knowledge in your mind, and to apply it wisely. You're beginning to understand what he means. The knowledge isn't stored in neat categories like the books you've heard Mediterranean scholars use. It's all linked, each piece connected to dozens of others, accessible through multiple pathways. When you need to know something about oak trees, you might access that information through a story, through a genealogy that uses oak groves as landmarks, through plant law, through boundary law, or through weather prediction. The same knowledge lives in multiple contexts, reinforced through these various connections, available through whichever mental pathway your current situation activates. It's an elegant system, really, refined over centuries to work with human memory strengths, rather than fighting against them. And you're learning to be part of that system, to make your mind into a living library where knowledge is preserved not as dead facts, but as living understanding, ready to be applied, adapted, and transmitted forward to the next generation of students who will sit in this grove, learning patience and observation, memorizing stories and plant names, slowly becoming the kind of person a community can trust with the accumulated wisdom of generations. 10 years into your training now, and you're finally beginning to understand how everything you've learned actually functions in community life. The stories, the genealogies, the plant knowledge, the understanding of weather and seasons, and the understanding of animal behavior, it all comes together in the daily work of maintaining social stability and cultural continuity. You're 26 years old, which means you're past the age when most of your childhood peers married and started families of their own. Some of them now have children approaching the age you were when your training began. You've watched friends become parents, watched parents become grandparents, and watched the slow rotation of generations that structures community life. But you've stood slightly apart from this cycle, neither fully removed from community nor fully embedded in it. This marginality is intentional, you've come to understand. A druid who's too involved in family concerns, too invested in a particular household's success, can't serve the community impartially. You maintain relationships with your birth family, but your primary loyalty is to your role, to the knowledge you carry, and to the communities that depend on that knowledge. Today you're attending a seasonal gathering where multiple communities come together to trade goods, arrange marriages, settle disputes, and simply enjoy each other's company. These gatherings happen 4 times a year, aligned with solar and agricultural cycles. They're part practical necessity. Isolated communities need regular contact to prevent insularity, and part celebration, marking the year's passage. Your role here is multiple and subtle. You help organize the ritual observations that mark the gathering's beginning and end, not because these rituals hold magical power, but because shared ceremony creates cohesion, reminds people of common identity, and provides psychological transition between ordinary time and the special time of the gathering. The prayers and invocations you lead aren't requests to supernatural beings, though later Roman writers will claim they are. They're simply formalized expressions of hope and gratitude, given poetry and structure, connecting current communities to ancestors who perform similar rituals in the same ways. Between ceremonies, you circulate among the gathered people, listening to conversations, noting tensions that might require intervention, and connecting people who could benefit from knowing each other. A family from the northern settlements mentions crop difficulties. Their grain yield is declining year after year. You remember similar situations described in the stories. Remember the solutions that worked. You suggest they let certain fields lie fallow, explain the principle of soil exhaustion and renewal, and offer seeds for legumes that restore nutrients to tired earth. A young man seeks you out privately. He's troubled by persistent nightmares and by a sense of anxiety that won't lift. You talk with him at length, not rushing, not offering quick solutions. Eventually, you learn that his father died suddenly last spring, before their relationship had fully healed from earlier conflicts. The nightmares are his mind's way of processing unfinished business, unspoken words. You can't erase this pain, but you can contextualize it, help him understand that grief takes many forms, and assure him that his dreams are normal rather than signs of illness or spiritual corruption. You give him a mild herbal preparation to help with sleep, but more importantly, you give him permission to grieve in his own time, in his own way. Two families approach you together. They've arranged a marriage between their children, but now they're arguing about the proper exchange of goods that should accompany the union. One family, wealthier in cattle, thinks the exchange should be calculated in livestock. The other, wealthier in metalwork and crafted goods, prefers calculation in manufactured items. Both systems are legitimate. Different regions favor different methods, but this particular marriage crosses regional boundaries, creating ambiguity. You listen carefully to both positions. Then you recite the relevant section of genealogical material that traces how previous marriages between these particular family lines were structured. 3 generations ago, a similar union involved both cattle and crafted goods in carefully specified proportions. You suggest using this precedent, adjusted for current economic realities. Both families nod slowly. The solution works not because you imposed it, but because you revealed what their own shared history already established. They're not accepting your judgment. They're accepting their own tradition, which you simply help them remember. Throughout the gathering, you watch Dubnovalaunos and the other senior druids navigate similar interactions. They're constantly busy but never rushed. They move through the crowd with deliberate calm, available to anyone who needs them, but not inserting themselves where they're not wanted. They represent stability in a world where most things are uncertain. Harvests fail, people sicken and die, and conflicts arise. But the druids are constants, maintaining the same knowledge, performing the same roles generation after generation, providing continuity that individuals with their brief lifespans cannot offer. In the evening, there's entertainment, music, singing, and competitive games. You participate but remain somewhat separate. not because druids are forbidden from enjoyment, but because your role makes genuine relaxation difficult. People watch you, aware that you're always potentially observing, remembering, judging. It's one of the costs of the position, a certain isolation, a certain loss of privacy and spontaneity. Late in the evening, the senior druids gather for their own discussion, and you're invited to listen. They're coordinating knowledge across communities, sharing information about weather patterns, crop successes and failures, notable births and deaths, conflicts that required intervention, marriages arranged, and oaths taken. This information is being integrated into the larger knowledge structure and added to the collective memory, ensuring that what's learned in one place can benefit others. We're a network, Katumandos explains. Individual communities could survive without us, but they'd struggle. Knowledge would fragment, each group developing their own variations of law and tradition, making interaction between communities increasingly difficult. We maintain consistency. When you travel to a settlement 3 days walk away and are asked to judge a dispute, you apply the same principles, tell the same stories, and use the same precedents that a druid in any other region would use. This consistency enables trade, intermarriage, and cooperation across distances. We're the glue, invisible but essential, that holds the larger culture together. Over the next several days, you participate in various aspects of community maintenance. You help a family trace their genealogy back far enough to determine whether a proposed marriage would violate consanguinity rules. You offer advice on the timing of a building project based on weather prediction. You sit with an elderly woman who's dying, keeping her comfortable, helping her family understand what to expect, and offering continuity and calm during an emotionally chaotic time. You're struck by how much of druidic work is simply being present, being steady, being the person who doesn't panic. You've been trained to hold vast amounts of knowledge, yes, but you're realizing that the training also shaped your temperament, made you into someone who can remain calm while others are anxious, who can think clearly while others are emotionally overwhelmed, and who can remember precedent and principle when others are caught up in immediate crisis. The gathering ends with another ceremony, this one marking successful completion of the season's work and expressing hope for the coming season. You lead the formal speeches, your voice carrying across the assembled communities, linking this moment to similar moments, stretching back through generations. The words you speak are ancient, memorized from teachers who learned them from their teachers, on back through time until their origin is lost, but their continuity is unbroken. As people disperse back to their home settlements, you reflect on these several days. Nothing dramatic happened. No major conflicts, no crises, no calls for extraordinary wisdom. Just the ordinary work of maintaining community life, helping people navigate the standard difficulties of human existence, and keeping cultural knowledge alive and accessible. But this ordinary work you're realizing is the actual substance of your role. The dramatic moments, the major disputes, the difficult births, the complex legal judgments are rare. Most of your work will be quiet presence, steady guidance, and reliable memory available when needed. You're becoming, slowly, the kind of person who can carry this role forward. Not because you know more than everyone else. Plenty of older community members have practical wisdom that surpasses yours in many areas. But because you've been specifically trained to hold cultural knowledge in your memory, to access it reliably, to apply it impartially, and to represent continuity across generations. You're becoming a human link in a chain of transmission that stretches backward into the forgotten past and forward into an unknowable future, preserving for communities yet unborn the accumulated understanding of all the communities that came before. 15 years into your training, and the focus has shifted almost entirely to legal material. You've mastered the foundational stories, the genealogies, the plant lore, and the ceremonial forms. Now you're learning the most complex and consequential material in the Druidic curriculum, the extensive body of customary law that governs everything from land inheritance to compensation for injuries, from contracts to criminal sanctions. Celtic law, you're learning, is nothing like Roman law, though future historians will compare them unfavorably. Roman law is written, codified, and created deliberately by legislators. Celtic law is oral and traditional, evolved organically over centuries through accumulated precedent. It's not inferior, just fundamentally different in structure and logic. The teaching happens through intensive case study. Catumandos presents you with a scenario. A farmer's bull gores a neighbor's cow, killing it. What compensation is owed? The answer isn't simple. It depends on whose land the incident occurred on, whether the bull was known to be aggressive, whether the cow was properly controlled, whether there's a history of prior incidents between these parties, what the genealogical relationship between the families is, and what the economic circumstances of each household are. You have to navigate through interconnected bodies of knowledge to reach a fair judgment. First, you search your memory for precedent, similar cases, how they were resolved, and what principles guided those resolutions. Then you consider the specific circumstances, the families involved, their histories, their current situations. Then you apply the general principles embedded in the relevant stories. Finally, you craft a resolution that addresses the immediate problem while maintaining social balance. Law isn't about punishment, Dubnovalaunos explains. It's about restoration. When harm occurs, we seek to restore the situation to balance. Sometimes that means compensation. Sometimes it means service or labor. Sometimes it means a formal apology and acknowledgement. The goal is always to preserve relationships while acknowledging that harm occurred and must be addressed. You learn the elaborate system of honor prices, the value placed on individuals based on their status, which determines compensation amounts for various injuries. A wound that would require substantial payment if inflicted on a high-status individual might require minimal compensation if inflicted on someone of lower status. This seems unjust by later standards, but within its cultural context, it makes sense. Honor prices recognize that people have different social roles with different consequences when they're harmed. Injuring a chieftain affects an entire community that depends on his leadership. Injuring a laborer primarily affects his immediate family. The system is complex enough to require the specialized memory you've developed. There are different compensation scales for different types of injuries, modified by circumstances, relationships, and intent. An injury inflicted during a drunken argument requires different compensation than the same injury inflicted in calm deliberation. An injury between strangers differs from an injury between relatives. An injury inflicted on one's own property has different implications than an injury inflicted while trespassing. You learn contract law, how agreements are formalized, what makes them binding, and how disputes are resolved when parties disagree about terms. In a culture without writing, Contracts depend entirely on witnesses and formal procedures. A significant agreement requires public declaration in front of community members who can testify to its terms. These witnesses become the living record of the contract, responsible for remembering its details if a dispute later arises. You learn property law, the complex rules governing land ownership, inheritance, and shared resources. Land tenure here isn't individual in the way Romans would understand it. Most land is held communally by extended families, with individual use rights passed down through lineage. But there are exceptions. Personally cleared land, land held by Druids for community purposes, and land designated for common resources like wells or gathering areas. Inheritance rules are elaborate, designed to prevent property fragmentation while ensuring all children have support. The rules differ for sons and daughters, for legitimate children and those born outside formal unions, and for children of different mothers when a man has multiple wives. You memorize tables of relationships and outcomes that would require volumes if written down, but that you can access instantly through trained memory. Criminal law focuses on compensation rather than punishment. When someone is killed, either deliberately or accidentally, the killer owes substantial payments to the victim's family. The amount varies based on the circumstances. Premeditated murder requires more than killing in self-defense or accidental death. But the principle remains consistent. Restore balance. Don't create new imbalance through revenge cycles. The law channels the natural desire for retribution into formal compensation, preventing blood feuds from destroying entire family networks. You learn the procedures for oath-taking, for providing surety for others' agreements, and for formal challenges and combat when disputes can't be resolved through peaceful adjudication. Every procedure has specific forms, specific words, and specific witnesses required. Getting the procedures right is essential. A flaw in form can invalidate an otherwise legitimate claim. One morning, you're brought into a particularly complex case. A woman claims her husband has abandoned her without proper procedure, leaving her economically vulnerable. He claims the marriage was never properly formalized, that they lived together by mutual agreement, but never performed the ceremonies that would make the union legally binding. Both bring witnesses, but the witnesses disagree about what actually happened. Some remember ceremonies, others don't. Some say the woman's family received a bride price. Others say gifts were exchanged, but not a formal bride price. Katamandos handles this case personally, but asks you to observe and offer thoughts afterward. He listens to all parties, examines the genealogical records to understand family relationships and prior connections, and considers the time period when the alleged ceremonies would have occurred, and what forms would have been required then. He questions witnesses carefully, not to catch them in lies, but to understand the source of their disagreement. Are they remembering different events? Is their memory affected by loyalty to one party or the other? Are they confused about which ceremonies they're remembering? Eventually, he reaches a conclusion. The marriage was properly formed, but the ceremonies were informal, appropriate for people of modest status, but not including all the elements that would apply to higher status unions. The husband's obligation therefore exists, but is less extensive than if the marriage had been formally elaborate. He owes his wife support, but not at the level she's claiming. He must provide her with specified goods and assistance, and must ensure her basic welfare, but isn't bound to remain married, or to provide at the level a more formal union would require. Neither party is completely happy, but both accept the judgment because it emerges from careful consideration of precedent and principle. Katamandos has shown his work, explained which precedents guided him, which principles applied, and why this particular resolution honors both the letter and spirit of the law. His authority rests not on the power to compel, but on the earned trust that his judgments are fair, informed, and consistent with tradition. Afterward, you discuss the case with him. "You notice the ambiguity?" he asks. You nod. "Many cases hinge on ambiguity. Our law is precise in principle, but flexible in application, because human situations resist absolute categorization. Two people can describe the same events differently without either lying. Memory is complex, and perception is selective. Our role is to find truth not through adversarial challenge, but through patient exploration, considering all perspectives, applying principles while remaining sensitive to human complexity. The years of legal training continue, case after case, principle after principle, building in your memory an extensive body of customary law that you can access and apply. You're learning not just the rules, but the wisdom behind them, the understanding that law exists to serve community welfare, that rigid application of principle can produce injustice, and that the goal is always restoration rather than retribution, and relationship preservation rather than absolute victory for one party over another. As your formal training approaches its end, you realize you've become something remarkable, a human library of cultural knowledge, a living link to tradition, a trained mind capable of holding and accessing vast amounts of interconnected information without any written reference materials. You can recite for hours without notes, can trace genealogies backward through dozens of generations, can recall precise legal precedents from centuries past, can apply complex principles to novel situations, and can do all of this while maintaining the calm demeanor that makes people trust your judgment. 20 years suddenly seem exactly right. Enough time to memorize the foundational material, to practice application, to develop judgment, to become not just knowledgeable, but wise. You're ready, almost, to take up the full mantle of druidic responsibility, to serve communities across your region, and to begin the work that will occupy the rest of your life, maintaining culture, resolving conflicts, preserving knowledge, and training the next generation who will continue this work after you've gone. 20 years have passed since that first morning in the oak grove. You're 36 now, no longer a student, but a full druid, recognized across multiple communities as someone whose judgment can be trusted, whose knowledge is reliable, and whose presence brings stability and continuity. The title isn't formally conferred. There's no ceremony marking completion of training. Instead, one day, Katumandos simply began introducing you as druid rather than student, and the change stuck. But becoming a druid doesn't mean your education ends. It means you're now responsible for transmitting what you've learned to the next generation. This morning, you're sitting in the same oak grove where your own training began, waiting for the arrival of new students. 4 young people have been identified across nearby settlements, children who show promise, whose memories are strong, and who ask the right kinds of questions. They arrive nervous, excited, and uncertain. You remember this feeling perfectly. You greet them formally, introduce yourself, and explain what lies ahead. 20 years of training, transformation from who they are into who they must become to carry this tradition forward. You see their faces cycle through the same emotions yours must have shown: anticipation, doubt, determination, and fear. Today, we do nothing, you tell them, echoing the words spoken to you 2 decades ago. Today, you sit here and watch the day pass. You notice what you notice. Tomorrow, we begin. The day unfolds slowly. You watch the students struggle with inactivity, with the absence of a clear task or goal. One fidgets constantly. Another keeps glancing at you, as if expecting instruction. The third sits with apparent calm, but you can see tension in their shoulders. The fourth actually relaxes into the experience, finding something meditative in the simple act of being present. This first day is diagnostic. You're observing learning styles, temperaments, and natural capacities. Not to exclude anyone, all 4 have been chosen carefully, and all will complete the training. But to understand how to teach each one, what approaches will work best, where patience will be required, and where challenges will arise. As the sun moves across the sky, you reflect on your own teachers. Catumandos died 3 years ago, peacefully in his sleep, at an age so advanced that no one could calculate it precisely. Dubnovalaunos continues her work, though she moves more slowly now, her hair completely white, her hands showing the tremor of advancing age. Andekamateros serves communities 3 valleys over, her reputation for fair judgment spreading far enough that people travel considerable distances to seek her counsel. You've become part of their lineage now, a living link in the chain of transmission. The knowledge they gave you, patiently, over decades, you're now passing forward. The stories you memorized, the genealogies, the legal principles, the plant law, all of it continues, breath to breath, generation to generation, refusing to be lost as long as communities value this transmission enough to support the people who dedicate their lives to it. The next morning, you begin teaching the cattle raid of Phlidaeus, starting with the same opening lines you learned first. The students struggle exactly as you struggled. You introduce them to the memory techniques, visualization, spatial location, rhythmic repetition. You watch understanding dawn on their faces as they discover that memory isn't an innate capacity, but a learned skill, that their minds can be trained to hold far more than they imagined possible. The work is slow, patient, and repetitive. You must resist the urge to move faster, to cover more material. The foundation must be solid, or everything built upon it will be unstable. So you spend weeks on the opening section of a single story, ensuring each student has truly mastered it before adding more. Between teaching sessions, you continue your work in the communities. You judge disputes, offer counsel, attend births and deaths, perform ceremonies, and maintain the network of relationships that holds the larger culture together. This balance between teaching and practice is essential. You must remain actively engaged with community life in order to teach students not just information, but wisdom, the application of knowledge to real human situations. One afternoon, a student asks you a question that stops you short. Why do we keep all this in memory? Wouldn't it be easier to write it down? It's a fair question. You know that people in other regions have developed writing systems and that Mediterranean cultures preserve their knowledge on papyrus and parchment. But Celtic culture has deliberately chosen not to adopt writing for sacred and legal knowledge, even though many Druids can read and write in Greek or Latin for practical purposes. Writing makes knowledge rigid, you explain. What's written stays the same, but human situations change. Our oral tradition allows adaptation, The core remains constant, but application can flex to meet current needs. Also, written knowledge is vulnerable. Burn the library, and the knowledge is gone. But oral knowledge lives in many minds across many communities. You'd have to kill every druid simultaneously to destroy it. The tradition is more resilient than any physical record could be. There's more to it, though you don't say this to the young students. Writing would democratize knowledge, making it accessible to anyone who could read. The Druidic tradition depends on controlled transmission, on knowledge flowing through relationships of teaching and learning that take decades to develop. This creates stability, continuity, and quality control. It also creates power. Those who hold knowledge have status, influence, and responsibility. Writing would change all of this in ways that might not serve communities well. But you're aware that change is coming regardless. Roman influence is expanding northward. Their written laws, their literate bureaucracy, their different way of organizing society, it's all approaching, slowly but inexorably. You can feel it in the changing questions people ask, in the new goods appearing in trade, and in the stories travelers bring back from territories where Rome has already established control. What happens to oral tradition when the larger culture shifts to literacy? You don't know. None of your teachers knew. This is a question your generation of druids will have to navigate, along with the students you're currently training. The tradition will adapt, or it will die, and which outcome occurs will depend partly on the flexibility you can maintain while preserving core elements. These thoughts occupy you in quiet moments, but they don't interfere with the daily work of teaching. The students must learn what came before, must master the tradition as it exists, before they can thoughtfully adapt it to changing circumstances. So you continue the patient process of transmission, story by story, principle by principle, technique by technique, building in 4 young minds the same extensive knowledge structure that was built in yours. You watch them change over the months and years. The fidgety one learns stillness. The uncertain one develops confidence. The tense one relaxes into the work. The naturally meditative one gains precision and rigor. They're becoming what you became. Trained minds, specialized memories, repositories of cultural knowledge. People who can hold space for communities struggling with conflict and confusion. Teaching them, you discover depths in your own knowledge you didn't know existed. Explaining forces you to examine what you know more carefully, to articulate principles you'd learn to apply intuitively, and to find new ways of communicating concepts that your teachers transmitted to you through different methods. Teaching isn't just transmission, it's deepening, refining, and discovering new layers in material you thought you'd already mastered. On a cool evening, 15 years into your work as a teacher, making you 51 years old, making the oldest of your current students approaching completion of their own training, you sit by the fire in the grove, watching flames create shifting patterns of light and shadow. You think about Katumandos, about Dubnovelaunos, about all the teachers stretching back through generations, whose names you know from genealogy, but whose faces and voices are lost to time. They live through you, though, through your memory, through your practice, through the knowledge you carry and transmit. And you'll live through your students, and they through theirs, and on forward through time, until this tradition either ends or transforms into something different enough that it would no longer be recognizable to its earlier practitioners. You're part of something larger than your individual life, larger than any single generation. You're a link in a chain, a voice in a song that began before anyone can remember and that continues forward into an unknown future. And there's something deeply satisfying about this, about knowing your life has meaning beyond personal achievement, about serving something that transcends individual existence, about passing forward wisdom that has already helped countless communities navigate the difficulties of being human. You're 55 years old now, walking slowly through familiar territory with a student who's in their 8th year of training. The landscape around you is the same landscape you learned in decades ago, but it's also different. Trees have fallen, new ones have grown, streams have shifted their courses, and human settlements have expanded or contracted with the fortunes of their inhabitants. This walk has a specific purpose. You're teaching what might be called sacred geography, though that phrase carries connotations that don't quite capture what you're actually doing. You're teaching your student to read the landscape as a text, to understand how places carry meaning and memory, and to recognize how human culture and the natural environment are inseparably intertwined. You stop at a spring that flows from beneath a massive limestone outcrop. What do you notice, you ask? The student looks around, applying the observation skills that have been trained into them. The water is very clear. There are offerings left here, small carved figures, strips of cloth tied to branches. The trees around the spring are old and undisturbed. People have worn a path to this spot, but don't seem to cut wood or hunt here. Good observations. Why is the water so clear? The student considers. Limestone. It filters the water as it flows underground, removing sediment and impurities. Water from limestone springs is reliably safe to drink. And why do people leave offerings? Because reliable, clean water is precious. The offerings express gratitude, create relationships with the place, and remind people that this resource must be protected. You nod. This is correct, but incomplete. The offerings also serve a practical function. They mark this as a significant place, not to be used carelessly. A stranger arriving here sees the offerings and knows this water is important to the community, that taking too much or polluting it would cause offense. The sacred, as we practice it, isn't separate from the practical. It's how we encode practical wisdom about resource management into forms that persist across generations. You walk on, stopping next at a standing stone that rises from a hilltop, visible for a considerable distance. The student knows this stone. It features in several of the stories they've memorized. But knowing stories about a place and understanding the place itself are different kinds of knowledge. 3 genealogies use this stone as a boundary marker, you say. It appears in 2 dispute resolutions I know of, 4 if you count cases Dubna Valaunos told me about from before my time. It's mentioned in the story of the 2 brothers. When was it placed here? The student examines the stone, looking for clues. The lichen growth suggests it's been here a very long time. The stories that mention it are old stories, at least 6 generations back, possibly more. But standing stones like this were being raised long before the oldest stories we have. This could be 500 years old or more. Probably more, you agree. Which means people have been using it as a reference point for longer than our tradition can precisely remember. It's outlived the people who placed it, and outlived the specific reasons they had for raising it here. But it remains useful because it's permanent, unmistakable, and visible. Human memory is fallible, but stone endures. We link our memory systems to stone, to ancient trees, to landscape features that persist across human lifetimes. The walk continues. You show your student where boundaries run, how they're marked by combinations of natural features and human constructions. A boundary might follow a stream for a distance, then run to a particular oak tree, then cross to a stone cairn built on a prominent rise, then angle toward another natural feature. The boundary exists primarily as an idea, but it's anchored to the landscape in ways that make it verifiable, disputable, and real. You explain how Druids must know these boundaries intimately and must be able to walk them and to testify about them when disputes arise. A Druid who doesn't know the land can't serve the communities on that land effectively. This is why training takes place in specific regions, why Druids typically serve communities near where they were trained. The knowledge is localized, embedded in particular landscapes, and tied to specific places. The Romans organized space differently, you tell your student. They measure it, map it, and divide it into regular units. They impose abstract geometric order onto the natural world. We work with the land as it is, using its natural features as organizing principles. Neither approach is inherently better. They serve different cultural priorities. Roman methods work well for empire, for projecting control over vast distances. Our methods work well for communities that live stably in particular places for many generations. At a grove of yew trees, ancient specimens that might be 1,000 years old, you stop to let your student simply observe. Yew trees have always been significant in Celtic tradition, though the reasons are tangled and complex. They're long-lived, persisting across so many human generations that they seem almost eternal. They're poisonous, reminding people that nature is powerful and must be approached with respect. They regenerate from their own decay, with new growth emerging from hollow trunks, embodying cycles of death and renewal. We don't worship these trees, you say, anticipating a question the student hasn't asked. But we recognize them as significant. They connect present to past, current communities to ancestors who saw these same trees when they were only slightly younger. They're living monuments, teaching patience and perspective. The walk takes you through varied terrain, woods and clearings, hilltops and valleys, streams and springs. At each location, you explain the knowledge embedded there, which plants grow in which conditions, which animals inhabit which habitats, how human communities have used and modified the landscape over time. The land is a classroom, and this lesson will continue across decades of practice. A Druid who stays indoors is failing their duty, you explain. We must be out in the world, walking, observing, noticing changes. A shift in plant communities might signal coming problems. A change in animal behavior might indicate environmental stress. Knowledge becomes obsolete if it's not continually updated through direct observation. The stories we memorize give us frameworks, but we must constantly check those frameworks against reality. By afternoon, you've walked for hours, covering miles of territory. Your student is tired, but you're not finished. You stop at a hilltop where several communities' territories converge, where seasonal gatherings are traditionally held. This location isn't random, you point out. It's equidistant from the main settlements, easily accessible from multiple directions, and visible from miles away, so late arrivals can find it. The hilltop provides good drainage during rainy gatherings. The elevation means evening breezes discourage biting insects. Flat areas near the summit allow for games and contests. Springs nearby provide water. The location was chosen by ancestors who understood how to work with the landscape rather than against it. You sit on a familiar stone and gesture for your student to join you. The landscape teaches if we attend to it, not mystically, practically. It shows us what works, what persists, and what proves reliable across time. A path worn by generations of feet is following the easiest route through terrain. A settlement that's occupied for centuries is in a location that offers good resources and protection. Ancient trees mark places where conditions favor growth and longevity. We learn from these patterns, encode them in stories and lore, and pass them forward to people who haven't yet lived long enough to learn them directly. The sun is dropping toward the horizon as you head back toward your settlement. Your student is quiet, processing the day's lessons. You remember your own such walks decades ago, how exhausting they were physically and mentally, how much richer the landscape became once you learned to read it properly. Tomorrow, you tell your student, you'll walk this route yourself without me. You'll recount to me everything you observed, every feature you remember, and every connection you made between location and knowledge. This is how you'll internalize it, not through my teaching, but through your own attention, your own relationship with these places. The training continues this way year after year, walking, observing, connecting memorized knowledge to physical places, building in the student's mind a comprehensive understanding of the territory they'll eventually serve. It's patient work, slow work, the kind of education that can't be rushed because it depends on repeated exposure, on developing familiarity so deep it becomes instinctive. You're teaching your student to belong to the landscape, to know it as intimately as they know their own body, and to understand that serving communities means understanding the places those communities inhabit. And you're teaching them that knowledge isn't abstract. It's embedded in the world, accessed through engagement with actual places, rivers, forests, and hills. The tradition you carry isn't preserved in some mental space, separate from physical reality. It's tied to this land, these communities, these particular circumstances. It's wisdom developed here, for here, by people who lived here across generations, refined through centuries of trial and error. This is what makes oral tradition resilient. It adapts to local conditions while maintaining core principles. The stories stay stable, but their application flexes to meet specific needs. And Druids are the flexible element, the people trained to hold stable knowledge while applying it wisely to unstable circumstances, to honor tradition while recognizing that circumstances change and rigid tradition becomes tyranny. You're 62 years old, and the world is changing faster than you can fully process. Roman influence, which once seemed distant and irrelevant, has become immediate and unavoidable. Traders now bring goods made in Roman workshops. Young people from your communities travel south and return with strange ideas, wearing foreign styles and speaking Latin phrases mixed into their native tongue. Most significantly, literacy is spreading. Not among everyone. Most people remain illiterate and likely always will be. But enough young people are learning to read and write that the fundamental assumption underlying Druidic tradition, that cultural knowledge must be memorized because writing is unavailable, is becoming obsolete. You're sitting in the oak grove with Dubnovelaunos, who at 80-something is now quite elderly, but still sharp in mind. She's spent the morning teaching students, but now they've dispersed for individual study, leaving the two of you alone with your thoughts and the early autumn breeze moving through the canopy above. I won't live to see how this resolves, she says, not sadly, just factually. The tradition as we've practiced it is perhaps 2 or 3 generations from becoming unsustainable, maybe less. Roman ways are too attractive, too efficient in certain domains, and too connected to wealth and power. Young people will increasingly choose Latin literacy over decades of memorization. You've been thinking the same thoughts, but hearing her voice them creates a hollow feeling in your chest. Should we be teaching differently? Trying to adapt? She considers this for a long time. Some adaptation is possible. We can write down the stories and preserve them in text, but written stories function differently than memorized ones. They become fixed and lose flexibility. A written legal code is rigid in ways that customary law transmitted orally never was. I don't think we can preserve the tradition by writing it down. We'd be creating something different, perhaps equally valuable, but different. So what do? We continue the work while we can, she says simply. We train students who want this training. We serve communities that still value our services. We maintain the knowledge as long as it remains useful. When it stops being useful, it will fade. This isn't tragedy. It's how human culture works. Things change. What served well for centuries may stop serving well when circumstances shift. You think about the students you're currently teaching and wonder if any of them will complete their training before the tradition becomes obsolete. Wonder if they'll use that training, or if they'll become the last generation of Druids, carrying knowledge that no longer has practical application. The Romans will write about us, Dubnovelaunos continues. They already are, actually. Julius Caesar wrote descriptions of Druids in his account of the Gallic Wars. Others will follow. They'll get us half wrong, will emphasize the exotic and mysterious, and will turn us into something more magical than we actually are. But they'll preserve some information, distorted as it may be. And that will have to be enough. It will have to be what it is, she corrects. Enough or not enough isn't really a relevant judgment. The tradition served its purpose for its time. We can't control how others remember us or what they find valuable in our practices. We can only do the work while the work still matters. Over the following years, you watch Roman influence deepen. Christian missionaries arrive, offering a different kind of cultural knowledge, one based on written scripture rather than memorized tradition. Their message is compelling to many people. It promises salvation, offers clear moral instructions, and comes packaged with connection to a vast Mediterranean world of learning and commerce. Some Druids convert to Christianity, others resist, maintaining traditional practices. You find yourself somewhere in between, not hostile to the new religion, but not persuaded by it either. You continue your work, judging disputes, teaching students, maintaining ceremonies, and serving communities who still want these services. But you're aware that you're becoming archaic, a living connection to a past that's slipping away. Young people regard you with a mixture of respect and puzzlement, unsure why anyone would spend 20 years memorizing information that could be written down and referenced as needed. The practical utility of Druidic training is diminishing. Written law codes are replacing customary law, Christian priests are taking over ceremonial functions, and literacy is making specialized memory less impressive. Still, some things persist. People still bring you disputes, still value your judgment, and still want someone outside the immediate conflict to help them find a fair resolution. Plant knowledge remains useful. The herbs still work whether you've memorized poetry about them or read about them in a book. The genealogies you carry in your memory still matter to families tracing lineage and establishing inheritance claims. You adapt where you can. You learn to write, document some of the knowledge you carry, and preserve it for potential future use. But writing it changes it, just as Dubnovelaunos predicted. The stories become fixed texts rather than flexible narratives. The law becomes a rigid code rather than an adaptive principle. Something essential is lost in translation from breath to ink, even as something is gained in preservation. Dubnovelaunos dies peacefully one winter night, attended by students she trained decades ago. The funeral follows traditional forms: ceremony, story recitation, and communal remembrance. But there's awareness that this might be one of the last times these forms are used, that the tradition she embodied is dying with her. You're now the eldest druid in your region, the carrier of the most complete version of the traditional knowledge. Students still seek you out, though fewer than before. Communities still request your services, though they supplement your judgments with written contracts and Christian prayers. You're respected but becoming irrelevant, honored but obsolete. There's sadness in this, certainly. The work you've dedicated your life to is ending, not because it failed, but because circumstances changed. But there's also acceptance. You've done what you were trained to do: maintained knowledge, served communities, and taught willing students. You've been faithful to the tradition, even as the tradition becomes unsustainable. That will have to be enough. One evening, sitting alone in the oak grove that's been your primary location for 4 decades of teaching, you reflect on what will be lost and what might persist. The specific content, the stories, genealogies, and plant lore will partially survive in written form, distorted and incomplete, but not entirely erased. The sophisticated memory techniques will largely disappear, no longer needed when information can be written down. The social role, impartial judge, ceremonial leader, keeper of tradition, will be absorbed by other specialists: Christian clergy, Roman-style magistrates, and written law codes. But something might survive that's harder to articulate: an approach to knowledge, a way of being in the world. The patience you learned, the attention to connection and relationship, and the understanding that wisdom takes time to develop, these aren't specific to druidic training. They're human capacities, cultivated through particular practices, but potentially applicable beyond those practices. Perhaps some of that will persist, carried forward by people who never memorized a single story, but who somehow absorbed the underlying attitude toward knowledge and time. This is what you tell yourself anyway, sitting in the grove as evening deepens and the light fades. That your life's work wasn't futile, even though it's ending. That the tradition served its purpose, even though its time is passing. And that change is natural and resistance is pointless. That you did what you could, as faithfully as you could, and that's all anyone can ask of themselves. You're 71 years old, moving slowly now, your joints stiff in cold weather, your vision not quite what it was, your memory, ironically, starting to show gaps. Not in the trained material, oddly enough. The stories and genealogies remain crisp and accessible, apparently etched so deeply through decades of use that they're resistant to the erosion affecting your personal memories. You sometimes can't remember what you ate yesterday, but can recite 3 hours of continuous verse without error. The world has continued changing. Roman control is now firmly established throughout much of the territory that was once independent Celtic lands. Christianity has spread widely, becoming the dominant religious framework for most communities. Written law codes have replaced customary oral law in most disputes. Latin has become the language of administration and commerce. Even though native tongues persist in daily use, there are few Druids left. Most of your generation have died. The generation after yours is smaller. Many potential students chose different paths, saw no future in decades-long memorization of oral tradition, when literacy offered faster paths to influence and status. The youngest generation has essentially none, just a handful of individuals studying with the few remaining teachers, uncertain what they'll do with their training once it's complete. You still serve your communities, though your services are requested less frequently than before. Most disputes now go to Roman magistrates or are mediated by Christian clergy. Most ceremonies are led by priests following Christian liturgy. Most healing is done by practitioners who blend traditional plant knowledge with new medical ideas arriving from Mediterranean centers of learning. But occasionally, someone seeks you out for the old ways. An elderly person wanting their genealogy recited before they die, wanting to hear their connection to ancestors stretching back through generations, families disputing boundary markers, needing someone who remembers what the landscape looked like 50 years ago. Who knows which trees were boundary markers before they fell, and which stones were placed by grandfathers now long dead. Someone sick whom other practitioners haven't helped, hoping the old plant knowledge might offer relief. You respond to these requests, moving slowly through familiar territory, drawing on knowledge that lives so deeply in you that accessing it requires no conscious effort. The stories flow, the genealogies unfold, and the plant preparations are mixed with hands that have performed these actions thousands of times. You're a living artifact, a breathing museum, a human connection to ways that are passing. Young people sometimes visit you, scholars, curious travelers, and even a few Roman writers interested in documenting Celtic traditions before they vanish completely. You talk with them and answer their questions as best you can, but you're aware that they're fundamentally misunderstanding what they're seeing. They treat you as a repository of information, extractable and recordable. They don't grasp that what you carry isn't just information. It's a complete cultural system, a way of organizing knowledge and time and community relationships that can't be fully captured in written descriptions. They write down the stories you recite, and the stories become something different on the page, fixed, flattened, separated from the performance context that gave them meaning. They record the plant remedies, but miss the judgment required to apply them appropriately. They document the genealogies, but can't capture the living relationships those genealogies maintain between current communities and the ancestral past. Still, you cooperate with their recording efforts, knowing that some preservation is better than none, even if what's preserved is incomplete and transformed. Future generations, who will never know the oral tradition directly, might at least glimpse something of what it was through these written shadows. One afternoon, you're visited by a young Christian monk who's been assigned to collect and record information about pre-Christian practices. He's respectful, genuinely curious, and more interested in understanding than in judgment or conversion. You spend hours with him, and he returns over several days, carefully writing down what you share. "Were you happy?" he asks at one point. "Spending your life this way, memorizing instead of, raising a family, accumulating wealth, pursuing personal goals?" The question surprises you. "I had goals," you tell him, They just weren't personal in the way you mean. My goal was to become competent in my role, to serve my communities well, and to pass the tradition forward. I achieved those goals, or came as close as I could. Why wouldn't I be happy? He writes this down, but you can see him struggling with it. His worldview centers on individual salvation, personal relationship with God, and internal spiritual states. Your worldview centered on community service, cultural continuity, and role fulfillment. They're different enough that real mutual understanding might be impossible, but you try. Imagine, you say, that you're part of a choir that's been singing the same complex composition for hundreds of years. Each generation learns it from the previous generation, adds their voices, and teaches the next generation. The song is beautiful and important to everyone who hears it. Your contribution is just your voice during your lifetime, but by contributing your voice, you keep the song going. Would you feel your life was wasted because you didn't compose a new song? Or would you feel satisfaction in having preserved something valuable, in having been part of something larger than yourself? He nods slowly. I think I understand. Though we would say our goal is to sing God's praises, which will continue eternally, rather than ending when cultural conditions change. Perhaps, you allow, though your tradition is younger than ours was, you don't yet know what changes might come that make your current practices obsolete. Everything human is temporary. We differ only in how we respond to that impermanence. More months pass, more visitors arrive, record more information, and leave with their notes and partial understanding. You continue living simply, supporting yourself through the services you can still provide, accepting hospitality from communities you've served for decades. Your physical needs are minimal: food, shelter, and warmth. These are reliably provided by people who remember what you've done for them and their families over the years. One evening, alone in a small dwelling provided by a family whose land dispute you resolved 30 years ago, you reflect on your life. You've memorized approximately 300 major stories and poems, comprising perhaps 200 hours of material. You've learned thousands of plant preparations and their uses. You've mastered genealogies, connecting hundreds of families across 6 generations. You've judged countless disputes. You've taught 32 students, of whom 17 completed training and 5 are still alive and practicing. This knowledge will die with you mostly. Some has been written down, distorted but preserved. Some continue in your remaining students, though they have fewer opportunities to use it. Most will simply vanish when your heart stops beating and your breath ceases. The library burns when the building collapses, but was it meaningless? You don't think so. For generations, the tradition served communities well. It maintained law, preserved cultural knowledge, and provided stability and continuity. It did these things as well as written traditions would have done them, maybe better in some ways, and certainly appropriately for its time and place. That it's ending now doesn't negate the value it had then. You think about the oak trees in the grove, where you spent so many decades teaching and learning. Some of those trees might live another 500 years, long after every human alive today has died, long after your entire culture has been absorbed into the larger Roman Christian civilization that's replacing it. Those trees will stand regardless of human concerns, growing slowly, enduring seasons, and existing in their patient way. This is somehow comforting, that the places remain even as the people and practices change, that the land continues regardless of what cultural systems humans overlay upon it. The springs still flow, the hills still stand, and the forests still grow. Different people will use them, understand them, and relate to them differently. But they persist. You're ready, you realize, for your own ending. You've done what you could. The work is complete, not in the sense that you've achieved everything you hoped, but in the sense that you've fulfilled your role to the best of your ability, and your role is now finished. The tradition doesn't need you anymore. The few remaining students are trained enough to carry forward what can be carried forward. Your services are rarely requested. You're tired, ready to rest. That night, you sleep deeply and peacefully, and you don't wake up. In the centuries following the last Druids, the final speakers of the old memorized tradition, Celtic culture underwent profound transformation. The oral libraries you carried in your minds were largely lost. Without living practitioners to teach the memory techniques, to perform the stories, and to apply the customary law, the tradition could not be transmitted intact. But complete erasure proved impossible. Knowledge persisted in fragments, in unexpected forms, in ways the Romans who wrote about Druids never anticipated. Some of what survived was written by Christian monks in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Men who came from Celtic backgrounds, who heard the old stories in childhood before entering monasteries. They wrote down what they remembered, translating oral poetry into Latin and later into written vernacular languages. The stories changed in this translation. Christian elements were added, pagan aspects were softened or reinterpreted, but core narratives survived: the cattle raids, the heroic cycles, and the mythological genealogies. These written versions are different from what you memorized. They're shorter, often incomplete, and sometimes confused in their details. But they preserve enough that scholars 1,000 years later can glimpse something of the tradition's structure and content. Through these medieval manuscripts, fragments of your training survive into the modern world. Plant knowledge persisted more directly. The herbs that worked for pain and fever and wound care continued working, regardless of religious frameworks or cultural changes. Folk practitioners who never underwent formal Druidic training nonetheless used many of the same remedies, passing knowledge forward through family lines and community networks. Some of this knowledge eventually entered written herbals. Much more stayed oral, transmitted mother to daughter, healer to apprentice, across generations that barely remembered the tradition's Druidic origins. Legal principles embedded in the memorized stories influenced early medieval Irish law codes. The Brehon laws, written down by Christian scholars, contain echoes of the oral legal tradition you spent years learning. The emphasis on compensation rather than punishment, the complex honor prices, and the attention to relationships and context rather than abstract principles. These persist in written form, adapted to new circumstances, but recognizably descended from the older oral system. Memory techniques developed by Druids weren't lost completely either. Christian monasteries, which required monks to memorize extensive liturgical materials, employed similar methods: visualization, spatial organization, and rhythmic repetition. The method of loci that classical authors attributed to Greek invention had parallel developments in Celtic oral tradition, and some of those techniques probably influenced monastic educational practices. The social role evolved rather than disappearing. Christian clergy absorbed many Druidic functions: ceremonial leadership, dispute resolution, maintenance of genealogical records, and education of youth. The roles weren't identical. Christian clergy answered to church hierarchy and Roman administrative structures in ways Druids never did. But at the community level, priests sometimes functioned surprisingly similarly to Druids, serving as impartial mediators, applying traditional wisdom to contemporary problems, and maintaining connections between communities and their deeper past. Place remained significant. Springs you regarded as important for their reliable clean water continued being important to later communities, even as the conceptual framework around that importance shifted. Boundary markers you memorized continued marking boundaries. Ancient trees still served as landmarks. The landscape you learned to read continued being readable, though later readers applied different interpretive frameworks. Most profoundly, something of the underlying attitude persisted. The sense that knowledge takes time to acquire, that wisdom requires patience, that community maintenance is valuable work deserving support. This wasn't specifically Druidic. It was human, cultivated through particular practices, but not limited to them. And it survived in various forms through subsequent centuries, in craft apprenticeships that took years to complete, in scholarly traditions emphasizing deep rather than broad learning, in agricultural wisdom passed across generations, and in community practices honoring elders whose long experience gave them perspective younger people lacked. The world changed, yes, but human needs remained relatively constant. People still sought fair resolution of disputes. They still wanted to know their family histories. They still needed healing when sick. They still marked life transitions with ceremony. They still valued wisdom and experience. The specific cultural forms changed. Written law replacing oral tradition, Christian liturgy replacing Celtic ceremonies, and written genealogies replacing memorized ones. But underlying human needs persisted, and ways of meeting those needs adapted to new circumstances, while maintaining some continuity with older practices. By the medieval period, Druid had become a historical curiosity, a word referring to something from the distant past, understood largely through Roman descriptions that emphasized the exotic and mysterious. The reality of patient memory work, community service, and practical knowledge application was forgotten or dismissed as too ordinary to be interesting. Later Romantics would reinvent Druids as mystical figures, magicians, and prophets, projecting onto the historical tradition fantasies that bore little relation to what you actually did. But reality, mundane as it was, had lasting effects. The stories preserved in medieval manuscripts influenced later literature. Legal principles influenced institutional development. Plant knowledge influenced medical practice. Memory techniques influenced educational methods. Place knowledge influenced land use patterns. None of this is particularly dramatic or mystical. It's simply how cultural knowledge works, adapting, fragmenting, recombining, and persisting in transformed ways, even as original contexts vanish. In the modern world, thousands of years after the oral tradition ended, fragments continue circulating. Scholars study the medieval manuscripts, trying to reconstruct something of how the system worked. Neo-pagan groups create new practices, inspired by fragmentary knowledge of old ones. Linguists analyze the bits of ancient Celtic languages preserved in place names and literary texts. Archaeologists excavate sites associated with Druids, finding material evidence that contextualizes the written accounts. Herbalists explore traditional plant knowledge, testing whether folk remedies have a biochemical basis for their effects. None of this brings back what was lost. The lived experience of the oral tradition, the patient decades of memorization, the instantaneous access to vast interconnected knowledge the practical application to community life, and the transmission breath to breath across generations cannot be recovered. It ended, and its ending was final. But knowledge proves remarkably durable, even in fragmented form. What seemed completely lost sometimes resurfaces in unexpected places. What appeared erased leaves traces that later generations discover. Culture isn't static. It isn't purely preserved or purely lost. It's constantly transforming, with elements disappearing and reappearing and recombining in ways that make simple narratives of loss or continuity inadequate. You, sitting in that oak grove all those centuries ago, learning your first stories, could not have foreseen any of this. You didn't know you were part of an ending tradition. You thought you were being initiated into something that would continue essentially unchanged across future generations. And in a sense, you were right. Something did continue, even though the specific form changed beyond recognition. The knowledge you carried so carefully, memorized so painstakingly, and applied so thoughtfully was not meaningless despite its later loss. It served its purpose for its time. It maintained communities, resolved conflicts, preserved culture, and taught wisdom. That's enough. That's all human effort can ever achieve, to serve well the time and place we're given, knowing that other times and places will require different approaches. The oak trees remain. Their roots intertwine with the roots of trees that grew there in your time, creating living continuity across the centuries. The springs still flow. The hills still rise. The basic patterns of human community life persist. People still need food, shelter, justice, healing, ceremony, and connection to something larger than individual existence. The specific cultural forms change, but underlying human nature and needs remain recognizable across millennia. And perhaps that's the real persistence, not that any particular tradition continues unchanged, but that humans keep creating traditions, keep organizing knowledge, keep developing systems for maintaining communities and passing wisdom forward. The Druids are gone, but the human needs they served continue, met now by different specialists using different methods. The oral tradition ended, but the desire to preserve and transmit cultural knowledge persists, now served by different technologies. You did your part. The tradition did its part. The ending came, as endings always do. But the human story continues, always adapting, always finding new ways to be human together in complex, changing circumstances. That's the quiet knowledge that perhaps matters most, that cultural forms are temporary, but the human project of creating meaning and maintaining community continues across generations, taking new shapes as needed, refusing to be finally defeated by loss or change. The oak grove is empty now, in your time long ago, and in the centuries since. But the patient work of learning, teaching, and serving that continues in countless forms, carried forward by people who never heard of Druids, but who nonetheless inherit something of what you preserved and transmitted. The chain isn't unbroken. It fragmented, transformed, and created new connections. But it didn't entirely end. It adapted, as human culture always does, finding ways to persist despite all the forces working toward erasure and forgetting. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all we can ask, that our work serves its time well, and that something of its spirit, if not its specific form, finds ways to continue forward, adapted to circumstances we cannot predict or control. You did that. The tradition did that. And in the quiet persistence of fragments, in the unexpected ways Knowledge resurfaces across centuries. Something of what you carried continues still, changed beyond recognition, but not entirely lost, speaking across time to anyone willing to listen patiently to what remains.